It was a sweltering evening in August 1994 when Sarah Timmons, a 28-year-old art teacher, disappeared while driving home from her sister's engagement party in a remote corner of upstate New York. The party had run late, and though Sarah's sister insisted she stay the night, Sarah opted to leave, eager to sleep in her own bed. Her route home involved a shortcut through a stretch of woods known as Hollow Road, a single-lane path flanked by dense trees and infamously devoid of streetlights. The locals told stories about the road: accidents, strange noises, and the occasional sighting of figures moving in the shadows. Sarah didn't believe in ghost stories, but she couldn't shake the unease she felt as she turned onto the winding path. Her compact car was the only thing alive on that forgotten stretch of asphalt, headlights cutting feeble beams into the oppressive dark. The first sign that something was wrong came when her car radio began to hum and crackle. Sarah frowned and turned the dial, but no station would hold. Static filled the cabin. Then she noticed the headlights dimming slightly, followed by the soft chime of her dashboard warning light: low battery. "This can't be happening," she muttered, pulling to the side of the road. She turned off the engine to conserve power and grabbed her flashlight from the glove box. Maybe she could flag someone down, though she hadn't seen another car in over 20 minutes. The woods around her were unnaturally still. Even the insects seemed to have stopped their endless buzzing. Sarah stood by the side of her car, scanning the darkness. As she waved her flashlight, the beam caught something reflective in the distance: two faint, glowing dots. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the woods, sending Sarah's pulse racing. She froze, her flashlight trembling. The growl faded into a rustle of leaves, and the eyes vanished into the trees. It could have been an animal, she reasoned, maybe a deer or a coyote. But deep down she wasn't so sure. Suddenly there was movement behind her, a soft crunch of gravel. She spun around, her flashlight slicing through the night. Nothing. She felt her breath quicken. "Hello," she called out, her voice quavering. "Is someone there?" No answer. Sarah backed toward her car, but the atmosphere felt different now. The air was heavier, as though something unseen was pressing down on her. She climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the key in the ignition, she prayed the car would start. The engine coughed weakly, sputtered, and died. Panic clawed at her. She glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. There, barely visible in the pale moonlight, was a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tall and motionless, it seemed to be watching her. She whipped her head around to look, but the figure was gone. Heart pounding, Sarah fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Then a sound, a soft, deliberate tapping on the passenger window. Sarah turned slowly, every nerve in her body screaming. Nothing was there. She exhaled shakily, her breath fogging up the glass. For a moment she thought she might be imagining things. Then she saw it, a single handprint forming on the outside of the window, smeared and wet as though dragged downward. She screamed, scrambling to the driver's side, but her door wouldn't budge. It felt as if something, or someone, was holding it shut. Desperate, she slammed her shoulder against it, and the door finally gave way. She stumbled out into the night, clutching the useless flashlight, and ran. The woods closed in around her as she veered off the road, branches clawing at her arms and face. Behind her, she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. She didn't dare look back. Her lungs burned as she pushed deeper into the forest, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was following her. She tripped over a root and fell hard, the flashlight flying out of her grasp. As she scrambled to her feet, the footsteps stopped. Silence enveloped her again. She crouched low, holding her breath, straining to listen. A voice cut through the stillness, soft and lilting. "Sarah?" Her blood ran cold. It was a child's voice, but distorted somehow, as though it were coming from an old, warped record. "Sarah, come play?" She wanted to scream but clamped a hand over her mouth. The voice grew louder, closer, echoing all around her. Then came a laugh, high-pitched, unnatural, and wrong. She bolted again, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she broke through the trees and onto the road. Her car was gone. The empty stretch of asphalt lay before her, stretching endlessly in both directions. She turned back toward the woods and her stomach dropped. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the trees, its face obscured by shadow. But this time there were others. A line of silhouettes emerged from the forest, their forms wavering like heat mirages. They stood silently watching her. Sarah's legs felt like lead as she backed away. The figures began to move toward her, their motions jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on invisible strings. She turned and ran down the road, her screams swallowed by the night. A week later, Sarah's car was found abandoned in a ditch along Hollow Road. The driver's seat was empty, but the interior was smeared with muddy handprints. Her wallet and phone were still inside, untouched. Despite an exhaustive search, no trace of Sarah was ever found. To this day, locals claim to see strange figures along Hollow Road. Some say they hear Sarah's voice calling for help, mingled with high-pitched laughter. Others speak of glowing eyes watching from the treeline. But no one stays long enough to find out. Hollow Road remains a dark mystery, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurs, and where those who venture too far may never return. In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. That was chilling, wasn't it? Now let's dive into our next terrifying tale. The Quiet Caller. The first call came on a Thursday night. Emily Carter, a 32-year-old graphic designer living alone in a small New England town, was working late in her home office. The hour was creeping toward midnight when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something about the area code tugged at her memory. "Hello," she said, balancing the phone between her ear and shoulder while scrolling through an endless series of emails. There was no response. "Hello," she repeated, irritation creeping into her voice. And then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like breathing but slower, deeper. For a moment she thought it was a bad connection, the static warping some distant background noise. Then the breathing stopped and a voice followed. "Emily?" The single word was spoken so softly, it was barely audible, as if the speaker's lips were brushing against the receiver. Her skin prickled. "Who is this?" she demanded. The line clicked and the call ended. By the next morning, Emily had mostly shrugged it off. Random calls happened all the time, especially with scammers using spoof numbers. But later that day, as she stepped out to grab groceries, she noticed something that made her pause. Her car, a red Subaru parked in the driveway, had a smear of something dark and greasy across the driver's side window. She frowned, wiping it with her sleeve, and felt an oily residue. It smelled faintly metallic like old pennies. Unease wormed its way into her thoughts, but she convinced herself it was nothing. Probably a prank or a bird hitting the window. That night, she heard the phone ring again. When she picked up, the same voice greeted her, a low whisper that felt intimate and invasive. "Emily? Do you remember me?" Her chest tightened. "Who is this?" "You'll know soon." The call ended. Over the next few days, the calls came more frequently, always from the same number. Emily stopped answering, but the voicemails piled up. Most were just empty static, but sometimes she'd catch faint whispers in the background. Her name, a laugh, fragments of sentences she couldn't make out. Then the texts started. They began innocuously enough. "Do you miss me? I saw you today." But then they became disturbingly specific. "The blue sweater looks nice on you. You shouldn't leave your bedroom window unlocked." Emily's stomach churned as she read that last message. She darted to her room, checking the window. It was closed, but the latch was loose as if it had been tampered with. She called the police, but the officer who arrived was polite and dismissive. There wasn't much they could do without more evidence. "Probably some creep with too much time on his hands," he said, shrugging. "Let us know if anything escalates." That night, Emily barely slept, the thought of someone watching her gnawing at her mind like a splinter. The escalation came 3 nights later. Emily woke to the sound of something shattering downstairs. Her heart leapt into her throat as she bolted upright in bed. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911 as quietly as she could, and whispered to the dispatcher about the intruder. Footsteps echoed through the house, deliberate and slow, as if the intruder wanted her to hear them. She locked her bedroom door and pressed her ear against it, every nerve on edge. "Ma'am, the police are on their way," the dispatcher assured her, though her voice felt distant, almost unreal. The footsteps stopped just outside her room. "Emily," the voice on the other side of the door was the same one from the calls. "I'm so glad you're awake." Her knees buckled and she slid to the floor, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. Instead, there was a soft scratching sound like fingernails raking against the wood. Minutes later, the sound of sirens sent the intruder fleeing. When the police arrived, they found no one, though the shattered window in the kitchen confirmed her story. "You should stay somewhere else for a while," the officer advised. Emily agreed, but she didn't feel safer. Desperate for answers, Emily combed through her life for clues. The voice sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. Then she remembered the area code from the calls. It was from her hometown, where she hadn't lived since she was a teenager. A sinking feeling told her this wasn't random. She searched online for recent news from her hometown and stumbled upon an article that made her blood run cold. A man named Peter Grayson had recently been released from prison. Peter had been a handyman her parents hired when Emily was a child. He was arrested for stalking and assaulting another woman shortly after Emily's family moved away. Her hands shook as she read further. The article mentioned that Peter had been known to fixate on his victims, obsessing over them for years before making contact. That night the call stopped. Emily felt no relief, only a suffocating tension like the calm before a storm. She kept every light in the house on and a kitchen knife within arm's reach. At 3 a.m. she woke to a soft creak. Her bedroom door, locked hours earlier, was now ajar. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though someone were standing in the shadows watching her. She reached for her phone, but it was gone. A voice whispered from the darkness. "You left me behind, Emily. But I never forgot you." She lunged for the light switch, but before she could reach it, hands grabbed her from behind. Emily's screams pierced the night, but they were cut short as a cloth soaked in something sweet and chemical-smelling was pressed over her face. Her vision swam and the world faded to black. When she woke, she was in an unfamiliar room, bare walls, a single bulb swinging overhead, and Peter Grayson sitting across from her, smiling like they were old friends. "You don't remember, do you?" he said, his voice calm, almost tender. "You were so young, but I never forgot how kind you were. You said you'd always be my friend. But you left." Emily's voice cracked as she begged for him to let her go, but his expression darkened. "Friends don't leave, Emily. They stay." The days that followed were a blur of terror. Peter kept her confined, his obsession manifesting in deranged monologues and chilling acts of control. Every time she tried to escape, he would remind her, "I waited years for this. You'll never leave again." Months later, a hiker stumbled upon a shallow grave in the woods. The police identified the remains as Emily's, though the condition of her body suggested she hadn't died quickly. The media dubbed Peter Grayson the Quiet Caller, and his capture became a national sensation. But for those who lived in Emily's town, the horror didn't end there. Several residents reported receiving calls from an unknown number. When they answered, they heard nothing but a faint whisper. "Emily?" In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. It began with the lights. Allison Crane first noticed the flicker in the kitchen. A tiny pulse of shadow flitting across the room as she chopped onions for dinner. The overhead bulb dimmed for less than a second, just long enough for her to glance up and notice. She dismissed it as a power surge. The rural area was known for them. But then it happened again in the bathroom while she brushed her teeth later that evening. The light above the mirror buzzed faintly, flickered, and returned to its usual warm glow. Allison paused, her toothbrush hovering in midair. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and tense. "It's nothing," she murmured, though her voice carried no conviction. The old farmhouse she'd rented wasn't perfect, but it had character. Creaking floorboards, low ceilings, and windows that let in beams of golden afternoon light. A place meant for fresh starts, for healing. But as she turned off the faucet and stepped into the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker. Like stepping into a dream where the walls closed in just slightly too tight. She double-checked the locks before heading to bed. It was the wind that woke her. At least that's what she told herself. A low moan swept through the house, rattling the old windows in their frames. Allison rolled over, groggily squinting at the clock. 3:14 a.m. The kind of hour where everything feels sharper, more fragile, as if the world teeters on the edge of some unseen boundary. She was about to turn over and drift back to sleep when she heard it, the faint scrape of wood against wood. Her eyes snapped open and her breath caught in her throat. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like a chair being dragged across the floor. She lay perfectly still, straining her ears. Another scrape, louder this time. It was coming from downstairs. Allison sat up, her heart hammering. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. The beam cast long, exaggerated shadows on the walls as she crept toward the bedroom door. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Her pulse quickened as she descended the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps feeling deafening in the oppressive silence. At the bottom she froze. The dining room table, her grandmother's heirloom, had been moved. It now stood crookedly against the far wall, chairs scattered haphazardly around it. For a moment she thought she might faint. She hadn't moved the table. She hadn't touched it. A chill raced up her spine. The following morning she called the landlord. "Has anyone else had issues with the house?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. The old man on the other end chuckled, a raspy sound like grinding gravel. "It's an old house. Makes noises. You'll get used to it." "But the furniture moved," she pressed, frustration edging into her tone. "I didn't move it. Someone, or something, was inside." "Locks are solid," he replied flatly. "No one's getting in unless you let them. Just your imagination." Allison hung up, unsatisfied, but what choice did she have? The day passed uneventfully, the summer heat thick and drowsy. By evening she almost convinced herself that she'd overreacted. That night the scratching started. It began as a faint rustle, like mice scurrying inside the walls. Then came the distinct sound of fingernails scraping wood, slow, deliberate. She bolted upright in bed, clutching the covers to her chest. Her ears strained against the silence, every hair on her body standing on end. The sound wasn't in the walls. It was coming from the ceiling. From the attic. For hours, Allison lay frozen in bed, heart racing as the sounds continued above her. The scratching stopped abruptly just before dawn, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavier than any noise. By daylight, the attic seemed less threatening. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench, she climbed the narrow staircase and pushed open the creaking door. The attic was empty, mostly. Dust motes swirled in the morning light filtering through a small window. Boxes were stacked neatly in one corner, untouched. But near the center of the room, something caught her eye, faint streaks on the wooden floor as though something had been dragged across it. Her breath hitched. She followed the marks to a small trapdoor she hadn't noticed before, set flush with the floorboards. A sense of dread coiled in her stomach as she knelt and hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron ring. "Don't open it." The thought came unbidden, sharp and instinctive. But she had to know. Her trembling fingers gripped the ring and pulled. The trapdoor opened to reveal a dark void. A narrow ladder descended into a space that shouldn't exist. She'd seen the house's blueprints. There was no basement. The air that wafted up was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and something else, something faintly sweet yet rancid. Against every instinct, Allison descended the ladder, flashlight clutched in her shaking hand. The walls of the space were rough stone, damp with moisture. The air grew colder as she moved deeper. At the bottom she found a small room no larger than a closet. The floor was dirt, and in the center lay a ring of charred stones, remnants of a fire long extinguished. Scattered around the ring were objects that didn't belong. A child's shoe, a rusted pair of scissors, and a cracked mirror. The mirror caught her attention. Its surface was fogged with grime, but as she reached out to wipe it clean, she froze. A reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her own. The face was pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth that hung open as if mid-scream. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled wildly, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. That's when she saw it. In the corner of the room, hunched and watching, was a figure. Allison's breath caught in her throat as her flashlight's beam trembled on the figure in the corner. The shape was human, almost. The head tilted unnaturally to the side, as though the neck couldn't fully support it. The shoulders were hunched and the arms dangled limply, but the fingers twitched and curled spasmodically, as if struggling to form a grip. Who's there?" Her voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. The figure didn't move. Its face remained obscured in the shadows, though she could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing as if it were burrowing into her skull. Slowly, she reached for her flashlight, but the moment her fingers brushed it, the thing in the corner shifted. A crackling sound filled the small room, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. It stood, its full height revealed to be impossibly tall, its head grazing the low ceiling. And then it began to move toward her. The way it moved was wrong, disjointed and jerky like a puppet on tangled strings. Each step brought it closer, and Allison stumbled back, her heel catching on a loose stone. She fell hard, the flashlight rolling out of reach, its beam now pointing uselessly at the wall. "Allison." The voice was low and rasping, but somehow familiar. She stared in horror as the figure stepped fully into the faint light. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless like unformed clay. But it was shifting, warping as though trying to take on a shape. And then she saw it. The face it was forming was hers. Allison scrambled to her feet and bolted for the ladder. She didn't dare look back as she clawed her way up, the wooden rungs biting into her hands. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew louder, faster, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. She burst into the attic and slammed the trapdoor shut, throwing her weight onto it just as something below slammed against it. The impact sent a jolt through her body, but she held firm, her entire frame shaking as whatever was below clawed and pounded at the wood. Then as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. Allison pressed her ear to the trapdoor, her breath shallow. "Let me out," the voice whispered from below. It was her voice. She staggered back, her legs giving out beneath her. The trapdoor remained closed, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from it. For days, Allison barricaded herself in the house, unable to sleep, unable to eat. The thing in the cellar didn't try to come out again, but the house itself began to change. The flickering lights grew worse, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, stretching unnaturally long and lingering even after the light had shifted. And then there were the dreams. Every night, she dreamed of the cellar, of descending the ladder, of standing before the trapdoor. In her dreams, the figure was waiting for her, but it no longer looked like her. It wore her face, but the eyes were too wide, the smile stretched too far. "Come down," it whispered in the dream. "You belong here." By the seventh night, Allison could no longer tell where the dream ended and reality began. The whispers were louder now, constant, following her from room to room. "You can't ignore it," they said. "You open the door." On the eighth night, she woke to find herself standing in the attic, the trapdoor wide open at her feet. She didn't remember climbing the ladder, but there she was, staring down into the void. "Allison." The voice rose from the darkness, beckoning. Tears streamed down her face as she descended the ladder, her body moving as if controlled by invisible strings. The air grew colder, the dampness clinging to her skin. She reached the bottom and stepped into the small room. It was empty. The objects she'd seen before, the mirror, the child's shoe, were gone. The room felt larger, the shadows deeper. And then the door behind her slammed shut. "Allison." She spun around. The figure stood in the center of the room, its face now fully formed into hers. It smiled, a grotesque mimicry of joy. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. "You already know." And then the memories came flooding back. Memories she had buried deep, memories of the night her younger sister, Sarah, had vanished. They'd been playing hide-and-seek in the woods near their childhood home. Sarah had begged her to play one more round, and Allison had reluctantly agreed. She'd searched for hours, calling Sarah's name, but her sister never came out of hiding. "You left me," the figure said, its voice now layered with another, high and childlike. Allison's knees buckled as realization dawned. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting, warping. It no longer wore her face. It wore Sarah's. "You can't leave," the figure said, its eyes dark voids. "You brought me here. You opened the door." The walls of the room began to close in, the shadows consuming the edges. The air grew colder, the whispers louder. "I'm sorry," Allison sobbed, reaching out toward the figure. It smiled, its teeth sharp and jagged. "You'll stay with me. Forever." The shadows swallowed her whole. Months later, a real estate agent showed the old farmhouse to a young couple. The woman admired the rustic charm, noting how the sunlight filtered through the windows. "It's lovely," she said. "But, does it come with a basement?" The agent hesitated. "No basement," he said quickly. "But there is an attic." As they walked away, the faint sound of a woman's laughter echoed through the house, carried on the wind. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. Hannah Reed moved into the apartment on a chilly November afternoon. The building was old but charming, its brick exterior covered in ivy and the wooden floors creaking beneath her boots as she carried in her last box. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom unit in a nondescript part of the city, but it was hers. After years of couch surfing and a string of dead-end jobs, she finally felt like she was starting fresh. The first night was uneventful, though the silence in the building struck her as odd. The landlord had mentioned it was sparsely occupied, but she hadn't expected it to feel so empty. She brushed it off, attributing the quiet to thick walls or heavy insulation. At 2 a.m., Hannah woke to a soft noise. It sounded like a faint shuffling, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the floor above her. She stared at the ceiling, heart thudding in her chest. "Must be a neighbor," she murmured, forcing herself to relax. But when she mentioned it to the landlord the next day, his expression stiffened. "There's no one living above you," he said flatly. A week passed, and Hannah started to notice other strange things. There was the draft, for one, a cold wind that seemed to seep into her apartment, even when every window was shut tight. She could hear it at night, whistling softly through the corners of the room. Then there was the smell. It came in waves, a faint, sickly sweet odor like rotting fruit. She cleaned obsessively, scrubbing every surface, but the smell persisted. And then there were the cracks. They started small, tiny fissures in the walls and ceiling that she assumed had been there all along. But over time they grew longer, deeper, snaking across the plaster like veins. One night, as she lay in bed, she swore she saw movement in one of them, a flicker of darkness like a shadow slipping through the gap. She dismissed it as her imagination. But the next morning the crack had widened. The noises began in earnest a few nights later. At first it was faint tapping like fingers drumming against the wall. Then it escalated, soft thuds, scraping sounds, and occasionally a strange guttural noise that seemed to echo through the building. Hannah couldn't pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. One night, as she stood in the kitchen washing dishes, she felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the empty apartment. Nothing. But then she saw it, a shadow darting past the corner of her vision, so fast she almost convinced herself it wasn't there. Almost. She didn't sleep that night. The cracks were everywhere now, crisscrossing the walls like a fractured web. No matter how much Hannah tried to ignore them, they seemed to multiply overnight. One evening, as she sat at her desk, she heard a soft rustling noise behind her. When she turned, her stomach dropped. The largest crack, spanning the wall above her bed, was moving. Not the wall itself, but the darkness within the crack. It pulsed and shifted like something was writhing inside. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. The movement stopped. Then, slowly, something began to emerge. A single hand, skeletal and impossibly long, slid out of the crack, its fingers curling and uncurling like the legs of a spider. Hannah screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a lamp, and hurling it at the wall. The hand retracted instantly, vanishing into the crack. When the landlord arrived, he found her sitting on the floor, pale and shaking. "This place isn't right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't argue. He just stared at the cracks, his expression unreadable. Desperate for answers, Hannah began digging into the building's history. What she found made her blood run cold. The apartment complex had been built in the 1920s and originally served as a boarding house. Over the years, it had gained a reputation for tragedy, disappearances, mysterious deaths, and tenants driven to madness. The most infamous case involved a woman named Lillian Howe, who lived in Hannah's unit during the 1950s. Neighbors reported hearing her muttering about things in the walls before she vanished without a trace. The police investigation uncovered strange symbols etched into the plaster, along with deep gouges in the floorboards. Lillian was never found. The activity in the apartment grew worse. The cracks now oozed a black, tar-like substance that smelled of decay. The noises were constant, a cacophony of whispers, footsteps, and that same low, guttural growl. Hannah tried to leave. She packed a bag and ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, the locks refused to turn. And then the lights went out. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on her like a living thing. She lit a candle and retreated to the bedroom, where she sat huddled on the floor, clutching a kitchen knife. That's when the walls began to move. The cracks widened, revealing not empty space but something alive, shifting, pulsating masses of flesh and shadow. Hands reached through the gaps, clawing at the air, and faces began to form in the plaster, their mouths stretching wide in silent screams. "Help me," one of them mouthed. The apartment was no longer a place but a living, breathing entity. The floor buckled beneath Hannah's feet as she stumbled through the darkness, chased by the writhing shadows. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, insidious voice. "You opened the door," it hissed. "Now you belong to us." She fled to the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind her. But the cracks were there too, spreading like wildfire across the tiles. The mirror shattered, revealing a gaping void that seemed to pull at her, dragging her toward it. "No," she screamed, clawing at the doorframe. But it was no use. The darkness engulfed her, and the last thing she saw was her own reflection, smiling back at her with eyes that weren't her own. Weeks later, the landlord listed the apartment as available again. When a young couple came to view it, they marveled at the quaint charm of the place, ignoring the faint smell of decay and the strange hairline cracks in the walls. As they signed the lease, the landlord offered a rare smile. "Welcome home," he said. And somewhere deep within the walls, the whispers began anew.